As satellites are starting to become more and more powerful, more and more power hungry, you need more ability to process that power. Every watt of power that's generated on orbit needs to be processed before it can do the job that you want to do with that. We had developed our own metal melting system that would simulate space debris being melted down, and there wasn't anything off the shelf that would ever scale to something that could go to space. So we had to build our own system, and we've learned that we can produce those high power processing systems based off of the technology we developed for our foundry originally. So while we started off with this vision for a future of metal processing and having these steel mills of space and being able to take resources and use them and really drive the human expansion into space and all the abundance that can come from it. And we've been able to discover that there is this real need in the industry, high power processing systems, to enable that ecosystem to happen. I'm Gary Calnan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of CisLunar Industries. We are a Colorado-based company. We are focused on transforming things in space, particularly focused on transforming materials, power, and logistics and capabilities for satellites in orbit. Going back to back in my childhood days, I think relevant to the story, I have always had a passion for space. I wanted to, be an astronaut, to find ways to get into space, to be involved in the space industry. And when I think back, to where the inspiration was coming from, I can remember, things like watching the shuttles launch when I was a kid in grade school. I was sort of a child of the 80s and coming of age in the 90s. But I really remember this moment. It must have been around the turn of the decade, around the 90s. And there must have been talk of building lunar bases or something like that. And I had built this, I used to really nerd out with this stuff. I collected popular science magazines and stuff like that. But I would tape together pieces of graph paper, and I had taped together many sections of graph paper and actually drew out this whole lunar base that I was inspired to create from whatever I was reading about, with all the different pieces I thought should be there. And man, I wish I still had that piece of paper now, because it's as we built this company, it sort of feels almost prescient in how it's related. But so that was, back in those days, I was definitely very interested. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, ended up going to boarding school in New Jersey, and then I ended up going to the Air Force Academy, not because I had some, long military history with my family or anything. I just thought it might be interesting to fly planes. And, in my mind, it was a possible way to become an astronaut. You hear the sort of classic story of people going, becoming a test pilot and then getting an astronautical engineering degree and then becoming an astronaut. I'm sure I was one of hundreds or thousands of cadets who have had that dream in their mind going in. But turned out that I did go to the Air Force Academy, went there for 2 years and 2 months, ended up not being for me, ended up going from there to the University of Colorado, Boulder. At the Air Force Academy, I was an astronautical engineering major. When I got to Boulder, I ended up, for a variety of reasons, in economics degree with a business minor kind of background. And so my path really took a turn away from the invention of engineering to something else. And because I wasn't doing the engineering degree and I couldn't get into that anymore, I needed to find a path to find that inventive element. And that's where entrepreneurship came into my life. So when I was at CU, I was always kind of looking for an idea to do something creative, something that would tap into the excitement that was happening at the time. If this was sort of the late 90s, so this was at that time one of the big booms in entrepreneurship. And I was definitely old enough to see all the opportunity out there, but not really old enough to take advantage of the internet that was emerging as a thing. But I did want to get into entrepreneurship. So I actually started my first company right out of college. I graduated in 2001. So in my senior year in college, I started a company called Night Riders not at all related to space, but and there were some other ideas along the way before that we're just testing out things. But this one was a real business. The idea was to drive people home in their own cars when they had too much to drink. This is before smartphones, before anything like Uber existed. This is just taxis. As a typical college student, I experienced driving down and having to leave my car behind. So we thought, let's build a company where we can solve that problem for people. Got together with a couple friends, really bootstrapped it, didn't know anything about business except a couple of basic classes I'd taken, and kind of got like an MBA in real time trying to build a company from scratch. We ended up bootstrapping our way to actually existing for over 4 years. We raised a little bit of money from some local angel investors in Colorado and in the Boulder area, expanded our operations out to the greater Denver area. And yeah, we were driving people home in their own cars and they had too much to drink. We were going home in these mini motorcycles was how we got back from each ride. There's a whole other story around that, but that was the kind of the proving ground for me to learn a lot about entrepreneurship and business. And it definitely, even though it didn't work out in the end, didn't make any money off of it. And there were definitely some scars about how that whole thing came apart at the end. It was an amazing learning experience. It definitely set the tone in my brain and sort of set that fire for entrepreneurship, which kind of led me eventually to come back to it where I am now. In the in-between times, after that business came apart, we just sort of ran out of money and couldn't fund it anymore, and literally the lights got shut off on us and stuff. I went into the corporate world, kind of rebuilt my credit, got into the finance world. I was also interested in trading commodities and stocks and other kinds of instruments that were around at that time. And so, thinking investing is interesting to me. I got my Chartered Financial Analyst designation, which is about managing equities for different strategies for other people. Spent some time in the corporate world as doing corporate finance, then did some time as a portfolio manager for a small firm in Denver, and then went back to corporate finance before I got in the space industry, where I was a director of finance at a SaaS software company. I was in this corporate job, kind of feeling the urge to become an entrepreneur again, missing the thrill of that. I mean, it was a well-paying job, but I found that probably 30% of my brain was on the job, and 70% of my brain was like, I'm bored, I need to find something else, let's find a way out of here. I almost went back to school for an engineering degree because I wanted to get into space. I saw lots of interesting jobs that needed to be engineers. I brought this idea to my wife. She's like, man, if that's what you want to do, I will support you, but I think you're crazy. You're a director of finance, and to go all the way back to the beginning seems nuts. Maybe you should look for some other possible ways to do this. And so around 2015 or so, I started to notice companies like SpaceX were doing some real, making some real progress. There were companies like Planet Labs and others that were showing that entrepreneurial space was a thing. It wasn't just big governments and large companies that could do space activities anymore. It kind of saw this in beginning stages of a new wave of economic development, which to me reminded me a lot of those earlier days when I was in college of the internet becoming a thing. It was sort of, you could just sense the same sort of early opportunity for a big opportunity or big wave of economic activity. And I just thought, man, these things don't only come across your life once or twice, maybe 3 times in your career. I wanted to get into it. I wanted to be in space anyway. But I didn't know how to get in. I was kind of flailing around looking for ways to do this. Read a book from Peter Diamandis that he wrote called Bold, which kind of opened my eyes to this idea that I don't have to be an expert in the thing that I want to get into to build a business in that thing. I just have to have big vision about something that I want to do, and to find other people who share that big vision, who could come in and complement my business skills, my financial skills, with their engineering and technical skills, and we could do something with that. So that sort of opened my eyes that was possible. And I also learned, because he's one of the founders of the International Space University, about the International Space University. And then in 2017, I actually went to the International Space University as sort of my way of getting into the space industry. I went there with this, I had already, over the course of the year prior to going there, come to the conclusion that, to make an impact coming from the outside, it would be advantageous to be out on the edge of the industry. And to me, human expansion into space is like the frontier. And looking at what's out on the frontier and what's needed to create a real presence for humans beyond Earth, resources was clearly, I learned from others that resources was one of those fundamental things. Finding resources in space would be one of those fundamental things. So when I went to ISU, I went there with this idea that, hey, I want to do something out on the frontier, doing something with resources. I even found, was inspired by Deep Space Industries' name, and I was also inspired by some other ideas, CisLunar 1000 that ULA was putting out, and other things like that. And I thought, CisLunar Industries, that could be something. And looked for the website address, and CisLunarIndustries.com was available. So I just bought it before I even knew what I was going to do with it. Went to ISU, found some other, quit my job as a director of finance. Timing was really good because they had just merged with their largest competitor. So I got a little stay bonus for helping them to integrate the two companies, and then went off and at ISU. Just went into a room with some other people who were interested in this, people who ended up becoming the co-founders I'm still with today. And we just mapped out, what does the resources value chain look like for in-space resources? So there were companies that were talking about asteroid mining and lunar mining, extracting the resources. And there were companies that were talking about in-space manufacturing, like Made in Space and Tethers Unlimited. But there really wasn't anyone who was focused on taking those mined resources and transforming them into the feedstock that manufacturers could use. Kind of like the steel mills of that industrial economy in space. So we saw a gap from a top-down economic perspective that wasn't being filled. And then simultaneously was learning about space debris and the proliferation of that, and then adding on to that the number of satellites that are being launched on a regular basis, and thought, okay, maybe we can solve two birds with one stone here. Learn how to process materials in space, become that steel mill for the space economy, and also transform the problem of space debris removal into an opportunity. So where right now it's a cleanup project, it could be turned into a mining opportunity if we can show that we can use those materials to build other things in space. Now they become a feedstock for other manufacturing activities. That was the genesis of CisLunar Industries at the very beginning, and has since evolved as we've progressed with projects with NASA and the Space Force and DARPA and commercial partners and others. So at the very beginning of CisLunar Industries, we are sitting in Cork, Ireland, at the International Space University Space Studies Program in 2017. And I had my other co-founders. Some of them didn't stick around the whole time, but some of them are still there today. Walter Schroeder and Toby Mould in particular have stuck through from the very beginning. I'm trying to gather a team of people, gathered some complementary skill sets, engineers who could complement my financial skills. But we were in Luxembourg, or we were in Ireland. And all of my co-founders, since I was in this international program, were not Americans. And so I was thinking, okay, not that easy to bring foreigners to the United States to do government work or to work in an aerospace industry. But we also had a mentor at the program who was running one of the team projects we were working on. His name's Gary Martin. He was working at NASA at the time, but he was about to leave NASA and go work for the Luxembourg Space Agency. Luxembourg Space Agency was actually the Ministry of Economy in Luxembourg at the time. They hadn't even created it yet, but they were about to. So they're bringing him in to help them do that. And they also had kicked off this idea called the Space Resources Initiative. This was, I think, started in 2016 because they got this in their head that they wanted to become a center for asteroid mining. So they were legalizing asteroid mining and claiming the resources from asteroids as part of their legal infrastructure. And then they were going to try to bring companies in and help get them started and so on. So we thought, okay, this is a cool opportunity. We got a guy on the inside who can help us get connected with the right people. And then they had actually run a competition that fed into this Space Resources Initiative that just happened to like land right at the end of our program at ISU. So we went ahead and submitted our idea. Very, very nascent, like it was not well developed at all, but we submitted the idea as it was. Didn't get very far in the competition, but we had a friend who did get a little further. She told us everything that they did. They went to this accelerator and that accelerator. They met with these people at the Ministry of Economy, and they got to pitch it to the government and see if they could get some funding. Well, we know the people there. We could probably do that ourselves. So sure enough, we were able to line up the same meetings basically that she got as part of that program. And they had another conference that was around space resources that was about like 2 months after that ended. And so we just went, we went to the conference. We went a week early. We lined up all those meetings and we went around and talked to everybody. And we got a chance to pitch the Ministry of Economy because we had Gary Martin helping us get introduced to those people. They liked the idea. And so we decided we'll start it with Luxembourg, kind of be a small fish in a small pond instead of trying to compete with all be somebody totally new to the ecosystem in the United States and have to deal with the foreign stuff. And we'll set up shop in Luxembourg, hopefully get funding and build the company from there. So that's how we started out. We actually started off with the Luxembourg entity. We weren't able to, ultimately, and Luxembourg is great because they're very cosmopolitan. Most of their system is very friendly to business. They like foreigners, they're willing to help. You could talk to almost everybody in the space agency there because it was relatively small at the time. Probably still is relatively small, but there are some elements that are still quite bureaucratic and sort of traditionally European, which bothered me more as an American than the rest of my co-founders, I think. But anyway, we were able to get the company set up. We had like no funding or anything. We were just funding this out of our pockets, basically. And we went through a few cycles with them on trying to propose things to the Luxembourg government to get them to fund us. And we got pretty far along, produced some large business plans and fully built out this whole concept for recycling space debris and like had the whole thing planned. But the problem was we couldn't get over the hump of showing them that we could achieve commercial progress in a reasonable amount of time. They can't, they're a wealthy company on a per capita basis, but they don't have super deep pockets when it comes to just funding projects for a very long time. So they needed us to be able to create jobs, to be able to drive revenues in a reasonable amount of time. And we just couldn't find a path at that point in time to use our metal processing, recycling concept for space in a money generating business within the next 7 years. It's what they were thinking. And so we ended up realizing we weren't going to really get there with them, even though we got pretty far in the process, and then moved the company to the United States. In 2019, we established, reincorporated in Delaware, headquartered in Colorado. And because I was already living here in Denver anyway, that was easy to do. We had added some American co-founders. We made sure that we could structure the company such that, for the time being anyway, it would be majority owned by Americans. And then whenever we got enough American capital into the business, we would rejigger things around so that we could get back to the original breakdown between me and the other co-founders, and which we have now since done. But that was still leading us to the point where we didn't have any revenues coming in. We were still doing proposals. So this is really still the startup phase. In the United States, we used Clerky, I think, initially to do the initial incorporation, which was really easy. It was like $800 and then everything worked. That helped us get started. Brought in some real legal help a little later. We were actually going to do some real contracts. But up until the pandemic, we were working other jobs and using our own savings to try to keep this thing going. There were many times over those couple of years there where we had to ask ourselves, like, is this ever going to be a thing? We went to the Creative Destruction Lab, and I think that was around the same time frame. And that we got through part of that program, but not all the way through. So we were having trouble getting investors to jump on board. We were having trouble proving that we had some kind of commercial opportunity in the near term. And we definitely asked ourselves a few times whether this made sense. We went down a little bit of a detour for a period where we thought, oh, maybe we can use this technology to do e-waste recycling as a terrestrial revenue generator. Explored that for about a year, but that did bridge us until the pandemic. And then when the pandemic happened, some of this financial support that we were getting, the people got during the pandemic, including me and others, helped us kind of sustain a little bit. And then NASA actually pulled forward their SBIR cycle that year, the Small Business Innovation Research Grant Program. And they just happened to have a topic that was all about recycling defunct objects in space debris basically, that weren't inside the space station, because they had some programs for recycling things in the space station, but outside the space station, and using them as resources. I'm like, holy shit, this is what we have been talking about publicly for like 2 or 3 years now. We should jump on this, and we did. Right around the same time, we had been working with the Colorado School of Mines Space Resources Program since the very beginning, so we got to know those guys over there. They introduced us to Joe Pawelski, who was the last co-founder to join the company. I met him in 2020 in March, like literally right before the pandemic started. So we never even met each other in person, for, I don't know, several months. But he helped us get the proposal in for the phase 1 SBIR from NASA. And we won that in 2021. And that's really when the company actually began and became a real company. Joe and I became the first 2 paid employees for CisLunar Industries in May of 2021. So 2017 to May of 2021, we were just kind of windy river to get to something that actually got some traction. But it's sometimes I wonder, it seems like, there's persistence is obviously a common trait you see amongst entrepreneurs, especially if it takes you a while to get your thing off the ground. And, most overnight successes take years to get to that overnight. So, that, people just don't hear about. But there's just an element of stubborn determination and persistence, and just belief that we were onto something real. And every time we reinvestigated and asked ourselves, is this really going to happen? Somebody else we would talk to about it would say, this is a good idea. You guys should keep pursuing it. And so we would keep going. There must have been at least a half a dozen times where we asked ourselves, is this going to happen? Should we pull the plug? But persistence was, if you have a good idea and it's grounded in a real problem that makes sense, and you've backed that up with other outsiders to make sure you check your own, self-referential kind of thinking, that persistence to keep going, even when it seems impossible, was definitely one of the things that got us to where we were going. The other thing I think was key is staying curious and being willing to talk to everybody and not being afraid of looking stupid. I think one of my advantages actually is that I knew I was an outsider in the industry. So I would go to these conferences and talk to people, and I didn't have to feel bad because I didn't know something. They knew that I didn't know anything, and there was no pressure. And that helped me personally, just for my own psychology. But being willing to talk to as many experts as you can, and try to incorporate that in your thinking. And then later on, I think we learned trying to get feedback from actual customers, which we really had a hard time doing in the beginning because we tried, but there just aren't that many customers for materials in space yet. So it was a bit of a heavy lift sometimes for that part of it. The first major breakthrough for the company really was getting that NASA contract. I mean, we had this idea all along that recycling and processing materials in space was going to be a thing and had to be part of a future industrial economy. When it was going to happen, it was and still is kind of a question mark. But we knew that it had to be a thing eventually. Somebody was going to do it, and somebody had to deal with the space debris problem. Realizing that NASA had a topic that actually mapped onto that belief, that was for our company what made the company turn into a real business. And then, coincidentally, Joe had a friend who came in as a investor right off the bat there. So we were able to, match that small grant from NASA that allowed us to kick things off, and actually go not just from a lot of phase 1 SBIRs are only 6 months long. They have pretty limited funding. Many times you end up with a report or a study, but we were able to go all the way to a live demonstration of a prototype of our metal melting system that would simulate space debris being melted down with our electromagnetic induction furnace, and then we were able to coordinate with other partners we had met and started collaborating with. And we had Astroscale on board. We had Voyager Space was on board with what was Nanoracks at the time, with their cutting technology. Astroscale was gathering the debris, and then we made a rod in front of the audience live at the Colorado School of Mines. And then we had our friends in Australia who have a metal propellant concept. So we were actually the idea was to take debris and turn it into the fuel that could fuel the spacecraft that would go out and get more of the debris. So you actually sort of fuel the whole process from the debris itself and still have a lot left over that you can use for other things. That was being able to take that funding, the extra funding we had, turn it into an actual demo was definitely one of the breakthrough moments. And then I think that led directly into the next breakthrough that has underpinned a lot of what's happening today. We had developed our own power system for this foundry. The foundry runs on electricity. And there wasn't anything off the shelf that would ever scale to something that could go to space. So we had to build our own system. The first one was like the size of a toaster oven kind of thing. When we were doing the demo, this guy who was like an expert in electronics, especially in Tesla coils, which Joe, our CTO, was a big fan of. His name's Steve Ward. He's sort of one of the big figures there with some of the modern technologies for solid state Tesla coils. He came and watched our demo, and Joe's like, hey, come check it out. Maybe you can help me out with this thing. He helped us with the demo itself. And then later, he and Joe, between the end of that project, which was like November, and over Christmas into January, Steve was able to take that box that was the size of a toaster oven and essentially shrink it down into the size of a couple decks of cards to do the same job, 2 kilowatts of power, and run this complicated system. And then that system that drove that furnace has now become the architecture that underpins the patents we have for our power processing system, and has been like the key to our competitive advantage with a lot of our power products, which is where the core of the commercial business is today. So that, I think, was the first, those series of things was the first big breakthrough. I think one of the things I've just observed, I don't know if this is a direct learning from that process exactly, but it would seem that we got very lucky in the timing. There was this guy who happens to be an expert, was interested in what we were doing, happened to have time available to join us and help out on a part-time basis, and really advance the technology and become a key part of the company. And to be able to take that project that just lined up at the right time for us to go through. But what I've also, it seems like a perfect combination of good luck. But part of it is that I think that this kind of good luck happens all the time. And one of the things that entrepreneurs do when they are successful is they're able to just keep their eyes open for when that good luck comes your way. So learning to say Steve is good at this, let's bring him on right away, and capturing that opportunity as soon as we could. That was a confirmation of just the need to keep your eyes open for lucky opportunities and recognize them and then do something about it, and take that chance. I think that's a good example of that. Yeah, so there's been a few major setbacks. If we're thinking about setbacks for the company, I talked a little earlier about the early days when we thought we shouldn't keep doing this. Those were all setbacks, but it gets a little bit more intense as the company grows and you get more people who are depending on continued funding sources for their salaries, and you want to make sure that this dream stays alive and all the work you've put in goes somewhere. So I think that most of the major setbacks that have happened have been around funding. Last fall we were starting to run short on cash, and we had a lot of success up to that point and had other contracts we were working on. So we had a lot going for us, but fundraising was a challenging environment at that time. This was after the big boom in the SPAC thing for space, where there's a lot of frothy investment going in, and then kind of the crash around that happened shortly after that. We were trying to raise money unfortunately, kind of as that was fizzling out, and it made the fundraising process a bit more challenging. Got to a point where cash was running really tight. We were not sure if we were going to be able to make payroll. You know, this was around Thanksgiving too, so it was like, man, this is going to be a tough message to give to our employees who we all loved. You know, they're all amazing people, and it was sort of like, okay, what do we do? Do we just run out the clock and keep paying people's salaries in full and try to get something going? Do we try to do a partial furlough where everybody, you know, most of the company takes some kind of pay hit for a little bit until we can replenish that and get some money in the door? What we ended up doing was scrambled a little bit, and it wasn't the first time we've had to, you know, make sure that we had to cover some cash crunch, but this was the most recent one, probably most significant. And found a lending source who we had borrowed from in the past and paid back successfully, who, you know, we were trying to raise money the traditional way, just couldn't quite get there. This guy came in. He's been a true angel in the sense of like being able to provide capital when we need it. And he gave us a loan for about $450,000, which was enough to cover us through, you know, the payrolls that we had to hit and through where we could raise some money to get to the next phase of the business. We did have to go on a little bit of a furlough for a few weeks in that December. It was painful, definitely scarred the company in some ways, but we got out of it. We repaid the money that we had to cut from people's salaries for that period a month later, and we were able to leverage another opportunity through NASA to it was for a phase 2 extension. So we had a phase 2 project we were working on with NASA. And one of the things you can do is if you get matching money, you can, for $375,000, NASA will match that. So if you bring in investment for $375,000, NASA will match it 1-to-1. We were able to use that opportunity, which was coming due in January, to push some investors who had been kind of sitting on the fence for a little while to say, okay, fine, we'll put the money in. And then that money came in right when we needed it in January to get us the deal from NASA. We won that phase 2 extension, got an additional $375,000 from NASA, got the investment money in plus then some, and that set the stage. This was just earlier this past year, so that we could, now we're in our funding round for our seed, and we're about to close on our first initial close as part of that funding round. So it's been it was definitely an incredibly difficult, challenging period, and it really did center a lot around funding and timing of cash flows and contracts and that sort of thing. But got to be creative and just believe that it's going to work out to get through that sort of thing. And we were able to come out of it, and I think come out stronger in the end. So when I think about the takeaways from that challenge, for me, there's like this, because every week you could, if you lose a contract or you lose a deal or a key employee quits suddenly or somebody gets sick or whatever, there's a lot of things in a small business that could happen that could really put a damper on things. And next thing you know, you could be out of cash. I mean, most companies aren't running on a huge surplus that they're just sitting on. So I've learned to become comfortable with the idea that it's going to work out. Obviously, it takes effort. You have to do the things to try to make it work out. I told the story of how we did that, but it's I think without that, like, the stress is just overwhelming, and you need to be able to say, okay, the worst thing that's going to happen is, like, we ran out of money, we shut the company down, but in the meantime, we've learned a lot. We have all these connections in the industry now, and we can get another job. All of us can. We're all smart people. That'll be okay. Telling yourself that story, not always easy to believe, but because nobody likes going out and looking for a job. I certainly don't. But having that as a backstop in my brain, I think has allowed me to sort of set aside the fear of, like, oh, we're only 1 week away from running out of money, and just go forward as if it's going to work out, and do the things that need to be done to make sure that you're knocking down all those possible paths to make it happen. At least then, if it doesn't work out, and you've knocked down every path you can think of to make it work out, you can hold your head high and know that you did everything you can, and then people will help you in the industry that you're in if you want to stay in it. So where we are right now with CisLunar Industries, now is a really exciting time because we have gotten through that crux moment last year. We're now, we're running an investment round at the moment. We're closing on the first tranche of funding in that round. So we have capital that's coming into the company. And the really cool thing about where we are today is we have been, up until this point, since that first NASA contract, been working on research and development contracts where we're building prototypes, like getting the technology to work. And we've had a couple commercial customers with small orders, so 1, 2 size kind of orders. The reason we're raising money today is so that we can transition from that small batch production to actual manufacturing at some scale for the space industry anyway. We're talking something on the order of 10 to 30 units per month. And our focus today is really on our power systems. So while we started off with this vision and still maintain this vision for a future of metal processing and having these steel mills of space and being able to take resources and use them and really drive the human expansion into space and all the abundance that can come from it. We need high power, high efficient power processing systems to enable that ecosystem to happen. And we've learned that we can produce those high power power processing systems based off of the technology we developed for our foundry originally. And so we've been able to patent this technology, we've been able to get this competitive advantage, and we've been able to discover that there is this real need in the industry as satellites are starting to become more and more powerful, more and more power hungry, to do more and more things in space. And if you think about things that happen in space, it all runs on electricity, except for chemical rockets that you see launching things up into space. But once you're up there, it pretty much all runs on electricity. And so as more power is needed, you need more ability to process that power. Every watt of power that's generated on orbit needs to be processed before it can do the job that you want to do with that. That's the part that we make. And so we're really finding this amazing opportunity to tap into this trend that's going up, to start to manufacture at scale. We found a number of customers who their timelines are lining up perfectly, where they're getting orders from their customers for sometimes up over 100 units or more of thrusters for large constellations, and they need somebody to deliver this. That's where we are today. We're taking this money and creating this manufacturing capability so that we can scale into the future and create this power processing technology. But we have this other technology that builds off of this, which is we call it the P3 LRU. So that's power, propulsion, and propellant. And it's a line replaceable unit. And the concept there is, think of something like a cartridge that you have those components. You have your power system, which is our power processing. You have your propellant, which is the fuel tank. You have the thruster. Those pieces all put together as one cartridge that you could then take in and out of a spacecraft. Kind of like when your propane runs out on your gas grill, you would just take the tank to the grocery store and swap it out for a new one. We envision a future in space where you can do the same thing for refueling, but also to change out the capabilities of a satellite. So all that power stuff I was talking about earlier, that's leading into this other aspect of the business where we're transforming logistics and mobility in space, both for defense and commercial customers, with this idea for this modular cartridge system, which we call the P3 LRU. It's been exciting to try to pursue this. One thing we are observing right now is that as we get bigger and bigger, we're now having to scale our workforce more rapidly. And so going out and trying to hire the right people to do this is becoming an interesting challenge, although we're still finding a lot of candidates to come to work for us. Yeah, well, one takeaway from this I will touch on. When we first started thinking about scaling up to manufacture, I thought we would want to own the whole process from end to end, because then you know exactly how the manufacturing process works. You understand each part intimately. And I thought that would make a lot of sense for a company like ours to really really get all the insights we could get from doing it that way, and then also control the quality all the way along it. We were persuaded over the course of last year, while we were pitching this idea to investors, to consider contract manufacturing for at least part of that process. And I was reluctant at first, but as we started to look into it, we realized that really made a lot of sense. Not for the whole thing. We still design and develop the initial product and the designs for it. And we also will do the final assembly and quality checking after the product is made. But we've found what's really great is we're at this place called the Forge campus up in Loveland. And there's a lot of different businesses there. One of the businesses that's there is a contract manufacturer that has the capability to build electronic hardware in a DoD approved environment that it works perfectly for us to slot right into this scaling function, especially in the beginning when if we tried to build it ourselves, we would have to kind of guess at exactly which hardware and equipment we would need to manufacture these things at scale. And we might get a little ahead of ourselves in terms of building out capacity, or we might be a little behind the curve depending on customers. But with this contract manufacturer, it gives us this flexible pressure valve where we can just they'll take smaller batch orders, or they'll be able to scale up. I mean, they're not going to be our bottleneck in terms of volume. So pretty much as far as we want to meet the needs of customers today. And so a takeaway of being flexible in my thinking, and the team in general being flexible in how we review this, dig into it, see if it makes sense, but be open-minded to something like that might completely change the scalability and the amount of capital that's required up front to get something off the ground. At CisLunar Industries, the culture that we have created, and it's kind of funny because this also has evolved over time. So in the beginning, when we were all involved in everything, and I'm not an engineer by training, but even in that first SBIR project, I was still in there basically doing my own version of engineering, even though I wasn't trained for it. Making my ideas and working, even getting dirty with building the actual device and so on. But as we've built the business up, and we've had to differentiate our jobs into different areas of focus, and I've had to direct most of my focus towards fundraising over the last couple of years. I've had to figure out how to pull out from that. So we have always been a very flat culture. We're not hierarchical at all. We sort of think of all the founders and executives kind of as peers. And then we treat our employees, I always think of them as peers as well, even though we have different roles and different responsibility levels, of course, in that. So we try to maintain that. It's an open environment. It's friendly, and I want people to feel like there's no there is a chain of command in some ways for how do you organize a project and make sure that it runs efficiently. But if there's ever a problem or something like that, we try to create a culture where people can talk to any one of us in the leadership structure, and that's totally fine. So flat structure is what we're trying to create. I also want to really emphasize an idea to not be afraid to fail. I don't want people to be, I think if you're not afraid of making a mistake, you can go faster. The flip side of that is you got to be careful that you don't get sloppy and you're making unnecessary mistakes. But as long as we're learning from mistakes, I think we try to embrace the idea that failure is okay and is actually kind of desirable to a certain extent, so that we can move fast and try new things and not be afraid for them to go wrong. I was kind of inspired by OrbitFab has this over there. They have this amazing wall where they have sort of the wall of failures. And when we get our new location set up, I'd like to kind of copy that idea, because I think it's a great way to sort of celebrate the things that we're trying things that are out on the edge, and it's okay if it doesn't work. So that's another piece of the puzzle that is really important to me. The current state is interesting because we have a lot of different forces coming together, some that support the space industry and some that have been very disruptive. Obviously, with the Doge and the stuff that's been going on with government in the United States anyway, there's been a lot of disruption to some of the funding sources. That has been a challenge, but it seems to have been manageable so far. I think that there's definitely a move in the space industry towards, more involvement with defense. It's always been a defense thing, like from the very beginning, but there is, we have seen the Space Force in the United States, especially redefine space into a warfighting domain, as opposed to just an area where they have sensors and satellites. I forget what they called it at that point in time, but so that kind of reframes the need there, and it has definitely increased the level of involvement from the DoD. This is an opportunity for companies like ours, of course, because we make products that are dual use, so we can sell both to the defense industry as well as commercial, and so that helps for funding. I'd say, was this in space industry in general, or the whole environment of it? Yeah. So, that's part of the big trend. I think that we are heading towards a future where we're going to see, some of these bigger projects becoming reality. So, launch costs continue to go down. That's been a trend for the last 20 years. But that's now starting to get to the point, along with some of these other innovations like ours and other companies, where things like, data centers in space and large solar beaming stations and lunar activities are starting to become a real possibility. And I still think that, while there might not be a major commercial lunar economy in this decade, I think maybe at the beginning of the next decade is sort of moved out a little bit. Some of the other pieces are becoming, are fast becoming real, like commercial space stations and in-space manufacturing, like all these things that start to make the foundation for a real industrial economy in space are starting to come together. I think that's going to suck in a lot more capital as it starts to become real, and we start to see more and more exits happening for companies. And like we just saw, for example, Voyager went IPO a couple weeks ago, and doubled in price and stayed there for a while. I don't know what it is at today, but it did pretty well as far as IPOs go, given that it's a space company that's not yet profitable. So I think it's a really exciting time. There's always the challenge with funding. There's always the challenge with geopolitics. Geopolitics can be an advantage as long as it doesn't become too kinetic and into an actual war kind of environment up there. But as it is at the moment, with some rivalries, I think that'll help to push things forward faster. And I think things are looking pretty exciting at the moment. Yeah, I mean, I when people ask me this question, I think you could get tactical about areas to get involved, advice for other founders. What advice would I give? Like, you get tactical about areas of what should you get into and what kind of approach should you take. To me, I think it's not uncommon from other entrepreneurial pursuits. I think it's really about how do you approach the whole endeavor. And I always tell people, like, you gotta stay curious and open to possibilities, and try to keep your eyes peeled for the good luck that comes your way, because with all entrepreneurial endeavors, it never ends up the way you originally think it's going to, and the only way you get to that future state is by being aware of the things that pop up and the opportunities that you're creating by just going out there. The other piece of advice I would give for space founders, and this, not everyone's going to agree with this, I imagine, but a lot of companies go and they go into stealth mode, and then hear about them after they raise some money and like, hey, we came out of stealth. That might work if you have capital that you can rest upon in the beginning to develop a product. But even then, I think there's a risk that you end up building something in a vacuum that's not tested against actual customers. Space industry is no different than any other market. You have to talk to customers to understand if your product has any basis for being there. And we have, from the very beginning, when we had no money at all, gone out and told our story. And with very little behind us, we became recognized as thought leaders for this particular niche of the space economy, just by going out and telling the story. So I have always advocated for founders to, whatever their idea is, tell people about it so that you can find out if anybody else wants the thing that you're building. I think the best advice, and this even goes back to sort of my very beginning stages, was not from a person directly, but from that book that I read from Peter Diamandis. It was, this goes hand in hand with two things. One is you don't have to be an expert to make a big impact. Have a big idea that has a big vision, and you will attract other experts to your idea to go make that thing happen. That has definitely been true for this idea. And then, dovetailing with that is this idea that we have embraced of going out and talking to as many experts as you can. And that's part of what I got from being at the International Space University. Was there was like 200 experts there. You could talk to any one of them anytime you wanted to. And kind of building that into my way of approaching this whole idea as an outsider. I think those two pieces kind of are related, and they have been fundamental to the success. I think our ability to do remote work has been key. It gives us the flexibility to have, to live where we need to live and still be able to do the job. Our company has been distributed from the beginning, so that we wouldn't have the company we have today without that capability. I don't know what the most unexpected thing is, honestly. Like, I think sometimes I sit back and the most unexpected thing is that we're here at all in this journey, to be honest with you. Like, when we think back and like give our chance to sit and reflect on where we started and where we got to, the entire thing is unexpected and unlikely. And it's not always easy to do that, but I think it's been, the whole thing has been unexpected in the most wonderful and amazing way. Yeah, so you can always find me on LinkedIn. I'm on there pretty often. You can email me directly at gary@CisLunarIndustries.com. You can also, we have a website, CisLunarIndustries.com is our website, which is being updated right now, so you can find us there. If you're trying to solve a problem for high power and power systems in your spacecraft or your constellations, or you're trying to figure out how to create more mobility in your spacecraft, then come talk to us, because we've got solutions that we can bring to the table.